In our divided nation, too many media voices have retreated into their partisan echo chambers. It's either red meat or safe spaces. Where are critical thinkers to go? Well, you've got a home right here on the Charles Love Show. Charles understands the problems we face and will show they are rooted in culture. Prepare to be educated and enlightened with an emphasis on common sense, context, and the quest for logical perspectives. Now, here's your host, Charles Love.
Welcome to the show. My guest this week is Sheena Mason. She holds a PhD in English literature from Howard University and is an assistant professor of African American literature at SUNY Oneonta. As you know, I talk about race a lot and how the hyper-focus on race is bad, is the book Race Crazy. But Sheena takes it to a new level. She is the founder of the theory of racelessness, which by its name, you can kind of get an idea of what she means, but it's a little more complex and a little deeper than its name suggests. So here we have our conversation about her theory and race in America. Sheena, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you. You were kind enough to interview me. I hope that you enjoyed that conversation and people should go check out your podcast. But listeners to the show know that I talk about this pretty regularly, but I don't think I've had a guest on the radio program that talks about this. So you are the founder of the theory of racelessness. And if they don't understand what that means by the title, I will let you explain it. So what is your theory of racelessness?
So in calling it a theory, I'm highlighting the fact that it is a framework for how people can work to understand, talk about, teach about, and more importantly, perhaps solve and resolve that which surrounds race and racism. There are underlying rules to the theory, and there are tools to the theory. The first tool is what I call the racelessness translator. And as I describe the tenets, I think the racelessness translator, this idea of needing to translate what is perceived to be race or racial into more apt and precise language, will be clearer. Mm-hmm. Okay. And in addition to the theory of racelessness, the rules and the tools, there are also underpinning philosophies of race that are seldom heard, seldom taught about. So people generally don't know about these philosophies of race. And even though every person has two philosophies of race in American society, we get defaulted into how we think about race. And I'm sort of intervening into that space to say there's a different way that we can look at this to help us avoid some of the pitfalls and to help us avoid unintentionally upholding the same thing many of us would do well without.
So obviously there are many problems in the way we approach race. Most people are looking at it from a framework of what you're saying about blacks is not true, or what you're saying about whites is not true, which, is understandable. I mean, I do that sometimes, but explain to them the difference with your approach on race that's, I guess, more macro. You're saying there's a problem before you get down to the point about what you're saying about white people is painting with a broad brush, like people would say, but there's a bigger problem, right?
That's right. So what happens in every single human society, and I've yet to know of a place or a time where this didn't happen, is that there's a group who wishes to subjugate another group and thereby racializes that group. The Nazis did it with the Jews. They decided, hey, these Jews are an inferior race of beings, right? And then they used that racialization to justify their attempted annihilation of the Jews. In Rwanda, you have the Hutus, the Tutsis, and the TWAs fighting against each other, and there's a genocide there, and there's a racialization of this particular ethnic group that then is supposed to justify the oppression and genocide of those people. In American society, racialization took the form of white and black primarily, right? And in the earlier days before we became the United States, we take the concept of race and we take the practice of racializing, which is simply simply thought of as applying race or imposing race onto groups of people. And we take the language of white and black and of color, and we use that to reflect and maintain the class system that was already on the ground because of chattel slavery. And part of the problem that we see happening in 2022 is all of this time later, right, well over a century later, we've continued to fight against what we perceive to be injustices using and within the framework that was given to us by people who knew that it would keep us divided, right? It keeps us divided emotionally in a lot of ways, psychologically. And so when you see people fighting against being racialized as white or fighting against being racialized as black, but they're using the language of there are white people and there are black people in the first place, that's a sort of intervention that the theory brings to the fore, because to my mind, and these are part of the rules of the theory, race is not biological. I agree with modern scientists. And race does not exist as a social construction. Racism is a social construction. Thereby, everyone is raceless. And if we can help more people grapple with this different philosophy of race, then we can start to actually get somewhere, because we're not participating in the machinery that requires us to stay divided in the first place.
So if you're saying that this is something that's put upon others to divide and subjugate, and you're saying race is not, in essence, real, right? It's something that people are using as a tool, right? Usually not for good. But you also said that you gave some obviously factual examples of people subjugating other people and breaking them up into these groups. You said it's happened throughout history in all different societies. So I guess the first question, since we're kind of sticking with the macro, is it seems like it's a function of human nature. So what's different about what's happening in America, and why would it not continue to be the case?
Well, first, I want to emphasize a difference between what I'm saying and how you just re-articulated it. Mm-hmm. So a lot of us are defaulted into viewing race as a social construction. Right. And a lot of people, in calling race a social construction, will say things like race isn't real. It's just a tool that people use in society to divide and conquer and all of that. But part of the gap between that sort of framework or way of thinking and what I'm saying is, if something is a social construction, it is real. Mm-hmm. By definition, for something to be socially constructed, it's real and it has real consequences. So constructionists fall into the trap of saying race isn't real, it's a tool, which is the same as saying it's real. Mm-hmm. Theory of racelessness, I'm saying it's not real at all. Racism is a social construction. Racism is real. Mm-hmm. And it requires our continued belief in race in order to maintain itself. It's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy in a way, that we continue to see ourselves and divide ourselves along the lines of how we racialize ourselves. And that unreality of race unlocks something for a lot of people that might not otherwise be able to access it, which is the fact of racism isn't everywhere, right? One of the rules of the theory, racism isn't everywhere, and it's not the cause for every disparity or discrepancy or negative interaction. And at the same time, it's not nowhere either, right? And when you unlock the door for some folks to think about it differently, it helps people on both sides, in quotation marks, avoid the pitfalls of seeing it everywhere or seeing it nowhere. And to your point about human nature, it is absolutely a fundamental part of human nature. But in American society, we don't only divide ourselves along these perceived racial lines. We don't only divide ourselves along those ways. There are economic class divisions, right? There are plenty of other ways that we have divided ourselves amongst ourselves. But the dominant way, the white and black, that way is, to my mind, something that we don't have to continue to do. We can make a choice to do something different for our young people, for our future, right? And just because it happens everywhere doesn't mean that we have to maintain it. And the fact that it happens differently everywhere, as I was describing earlier, the fact that it's not black and white everywhere, right, should give us inspiration to get ourselves up underneath how it does manifest in American society. I just reject the idea that, because it happens everywhere and because humans can be really vile toward each other, that we should just accept it. I'm just a forever optimist, and I believe in the strength and tenacity and determination of America, and I want more for people in America. We don't have to continue to suffer in these ways anymore.
Coming up, more with Sheena Mason, Assistant Professor of African American Literature at SUNY Oneonta and the founder of the theory of racelessness. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
We return to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer. Once again, here's Charles Love.
Are you tired of summer nights in Maine?
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with Sheena Mason, Assistant Professor of African American Literature at SUNY Oneonta and the founder of the theory of racelessness. And in this segment, I ask her, what is the downside? What problems manifest themselves by us viewing everything through a racial lens? And she explains that by talking about these extreme assumptions that people have of people just based on their skin color.
Well, depending on who you ask, it manifests itself differently to different extents. And something that you and I spoke about in our first conversation over on my podcast was how people tend to see the same numbers or the same statistics, and they interpret it in ways that uphold the craziness of this like racialized worldview.
Right, I talk about that a lot. Yep.
Yeah, and it was awesome because you enlightened me and you put me onto some things that I hadn't necessarily yet discovered at that early stage of my theoretical development. Mm-hmm. But one of the metrics that you and I spoke about was criminality by people who are racialized as Black in the U.S. And what we spoke about was how a lot of people have in their minds that so-called Black people are more criminal or more violent, but they blame it on different things. If you lean left, you will blame it on systemic racism. But infrequently do you stop to say, wait, but are people who are racialized as Black more violent, right? And if you lean right, you tend to blame it on an inferior culture, Black culture. That's the reason why racialized Black people are more violent. Infrequently is anyone stopping along the ways to question the idea that people who are racialized as Black are indeed more violent. They just accept that narrative and blame it on different things. Mm-hmm. By giving people a different way to study or see that same information, we can start to have a more nuanced and I think more true understanding of the problems that plague our society. And more importantly, then, because we're better able to identify and name the problems, we can then solve some of those problems, right? We can then address some of those problems, and we can stop the false belief in race in the first place too, which maintains our divisions, I would say unnecessarily, because once you start to look at data in an unbiased way, which I think we're encouraged to see in a biased way if we're looking through the framework of race, then the division is almost there de facto. Like it's going to be there always. And the problems still persist. We can address the problems and stop the built-in division.
Do you find, I know I do, but you talk a lot and you meet a lot of people, that even if you give them their argument on this racial division and the way things are, draw these lines based on race, that their arguments tend to contradict themselves, right? Even the people who want to look at things through a racial lens, they'll say, regardless of what their views are, if they want to say that it's racist to, assume things about people based on their race, but they want you to assume things about them, about their race based on what it is. So they say, the same people who say whites are racist or white people think these negative things and they talk about Black culture, they're the same people who want to say things like, well, Blacks are cool and Blacks have soul and Blacks do this, which is also generalizing all people who supposedly look a certain way and buying into the very thing that they're saying is a problem, which I would assume you would believe is one of the many things. But part of the problem in getting out of this is because as much as people talk about it as if it's a bad thing, they are holding on to it and acting in ways that seems like they really want it. They're promoting it.
That's part of the design of how racialization works. And one aspect of my work that I want to underscore is how I'm able to help more people who see the problem of racialization differently understand, like deep in their spirit, understand why that happens the way that we see it happening today. Because it is the fact that we each inherited racialization. We each inherited that practice, and we each inherited the sort of black and white binary way of seeing ourselves and each other. And in that way, when I look at a figure like Frederick Douglass, who fought for abolitionism, he embraced his so-called Blackness, right? Even as he complicated it, because if you read his slave narrative, the first paragraph, he says, my father was a white man, right? Meaning of European descent. So even as he complicates racialization, he's still working within the framework to fight against it. And how could he work out from outside of the framework when that's what he inherited? We get this through our education system. We are taught that there are 5 biological races of human beings, even today in elementary school. And then at a certain age, maybe high school, we start to say, oh, it's a social construction, races. But then nobody ever goes back to complicate or undo the biological realist view of race. So then you just have what I think are confused, adults who come into, their adulthood, who've been taught it's biological, right? They see that they're taught that race is skin color. So like you can see race about a person, or they're taught that it's DNA, which is still a biological view of race. But then they're taught to use the language of social constructionism. And it's no wonder that when a philosophy such as mine comes along, or a philosophy that pushes up against the importance or significance of that which is perceived to be race, is viewed as threatening, right? It's viewed as dismissive. It's viewed as part of the problem. And I think the only way that we can get around that, the primary way we can get around that, and part of the effectiveness of my framework is proving to be helping people see themselves outside of this racialization. And in doing so, helping people better identify the problem and identify the differences between what they value about themselves and what race is. Race is the dehumanizing apparatus.
Well, isn't part of the problem, not to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but that we hear a lot about this though. Part of the problem is that a segment of the population benefits from speaking in these ways and thinking in these terms.
I contend that a very, very small percentage of people actually benefit from this, and that those are and this is where I definitely sound like a conspiracy theorist, which I'm okay with. Those are the really, really, really top echelons of human society, the people with bukus of money who are actually running things, right? Mm-hmm. Who actually have the power and influence to change our government in any way that they possibly can, to get race off the census, right? To get politicians to stop using racialization as their talking points and dividing tool. The people who have like the real power, I would contend. And I think plenty of people are fooled into thinking and believing that they have power behind this racialization. And some people have gained power. When I say power, I'm really thinking about economics. Some people have gained power because of this framework that they've inherited and used to their benefit. But the vast majority of us, I think, actually suffer because of it. And I think it's a numbers game for me. I don't expect 100% of people to hear me talk and say, you know what, she's right. I really think that the statistical majority of people can start to see the light, and more of us are closer than we might presume. And as soon as the people start to speak and demand more of the media, demand more of the government, and demand more of their education system, those institutions will start to change to reflect the beliefs of the people. But right now, the people, even the people who are not benefiting, we're still talking about white and black as if those are real things.
Coming up, more with Sheena Mason, Assistant Professor of African American Literature at SUNY Oneonta and the founder of the Theory of Racelessness. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with Sheena Mason, the founder of the Theory of Racelessness. And in this segment, I ask her when she gets pushback, what is the most common pushback she gets for her theory? And we discuss those people like Oprah and Tyler Perry and other celebrities who are very successful but claim white supremacy controls everything.
Some people hear Theory of Racelessness, just the name, without even hearing anything or reading any of my work, and they hear colorblindness, which for some people, that's a negative, because they really are biological realists about race. They believe that skin color is race, and somehow they hear, am I contending with race, the dehumanizing apparatus? Instead of hearing that, they hear she wants to ignore all of the things that make humans different and beautiful, right? And then there's another type of person that might hear my work and they really, really, really want to cling to race, but for different reasons. They want whiteness, for example, to exist in a really fierce way, because they want racism to persist in a fierce way. And I just view both mischaracterizations of my work as being two sides of the same coin, right? And how I help different people grapple with what it is that I'm actually saying and why it's important is a very similar strategy. But is everyone going to be persuaded? No. And I'm okay. I'm okay with that. It's a numbers game for me.
Well, earlier I talked about some people benefiting from it, and you say it's the top, and most people don't, which is true. But then I guess the other side, so they may not be benefiting from it, but there is a larger number of people than the others who want somebody to blame. So race creates a boogeyman, right? So it sounds odd, but there are people who have a play aside in this race narrative. They want whites to exist, but not because whites are supreme. They want whites to exist so they can say things aren't going right in certain segments of the community or the country because of whites. So now it's a boogeyman I can point to. So that may be the reason why some of the others who aren't really benefited from it may want to have it continue. Am I right?
My response is complicated, as my responses tend to be, because even as I'm like intuitively what you're saying makes sense, I also think that what you're describing is a sort of avatar that exists in smaller numbers than we might think, because most people I know who believe fiercely in what they would call white supremacy or systemic racism, but not in the ways that the theory of racelessness would illuminate, sincerely and genuinely believe in those things, but they don't believe they don't believe themselves to be only victims, and they don't use that reason to excuse bad behavior. But then I hear a lot of people talking about that avatar as if that's what's happening. But I think that it belies reality in some ways, because even as I identify the problem and I'm offering a solution, I think it's a really ironically essentialized way of talking about people who have that particular belief system, if that makes sense. Like,
if I talk about the people in my circumstances, I agree and I somewhat disagree. It's not really that they're all pushing it like this is the main reason for my problem and all my problems lie in white man, right? So that would be true. That's not most people. But I know people who are middle class, moderately successful, not wealthy, regular, people. And they're just like, well, they say little things like, well, you know how whites are, right? They say these things. So they're not saying that all bad can be blamed on whites, but like you say, it's been in society enough and people have been trained to it. So in their mind, they still say, here's one. It will be like when Tyler Perry says, everything is not racism. And he's like, look at how successful I am. The fact that I bought the plantation that some of my family, my ancestors were slaves on. And then he had to throw in this line at the end where he says, imagine where I would be if I were white. Right. So it's that little, he's not saying whites are holding him back, but still there's a little piece of him saying that even as successful as I am, I would even be more successful if I were white.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Your explication of that makes me think about how there's a social class aspect of this that takes priority and gets conflated as economic class aspects of the dialogue as it pertains to racism, which a theory of racelessness works to address and help people stop doing. Because when I say social class, so Tyler Perry, obviously rich, right? Like has way more money than I will likely ever see in my entire lifetime. Very rich. And that story reminds me of when Oprah Winfrey talks about her success as a billionaire, right? It says, but don't feel bad for the average white person because they still got their whiteness.
More privilege than I do, right?
Coming up, more with Sheena Mason, Assistant Professor of African American Literature at SUNY Oneonta and the founder of the Theory of Racelessness. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
Now, more of the Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with Sheena Mason, founder of the Theory of Racelessness. And in the last segment, we were talking about Oprah Winfrey and Tyler Perry and others who are extremely successful but view everything in America through the prism of race and how that's detrimental to the country. She also talked about her interview with my co-host, Wilford Riley, who asked the question of, if we remove race from everything, how do you collect data and measure things? And points out that whites aren't as successful as people paint them out to be.
So it's like, there is this problem where people are encouraged to conflate social with economic class. There's a word for it, socioeconomic. Which encourages us to think in our minds that they're one and the same thing, and they are not the same thing, and they haven't always or probably ever been the same thing. And so long as we continue to prioritize the social class aspect of racism or racialization, then we continue to miss opportunities to have an impact where economics are concerned. And that's one of my deepest priorities and passions, because having come from sleeping on park benches when I was 17 and having to drop out of high school because I chose homelessness over staying in an abusive household, having worked with kids in rural Mississippi Delta and Arkansas, and at a last chance charter school in Houston, Texas, I have lived and I have experienced and witnessed poverty. And I am really tiring of the conflation of that which is perceived to be Black with poor, and if we were encouraged to see with different eyes and look at data, to look up data in the first place, but then to also look at data through a different framework or lens, we would be able to see the problems way more clearly. And then we would be able to solve and resolve both aspects, both the social and the economic class aspects of how we divide ourselves. But until that time, you can have, filthy rich people who really, even if they came from poverty, right? Like they've made it out. And they've achieved a level of status, but then they want to align themselves along racialized lines, which to me just supports the white supremacy that they're calling out. It actually creates it and makes it a real thing in a way, because they're putting white above them, even at that status. And that to me, I think is harmful more than it's hurtful, and it belies reality.
You just said something that made me think. I say I'm going to steal from you and go macro and say, you said until they look up the data, which is important, but I don't even think they're ready yet, because they've been trained so much to look at things through a racial view that they have to be retrained how to assess and analyze data before you can even give them the data. Because with the data, they'll just, like you and I have already talked about, they'll just say, all Black people are killing each other. Or they'll say,
that's right,
all Black people live in poverty. Even though the numbers don't say that, they'll just spin it to that.
Yeah. So I had the distinct pleasure of talking with Wilfred Riley on my podcast, and we were talking about this, and he was grappling with the bull. My co-host, check out the bull. Yes, he was grappling with what I was saying, because I was saying part of the problem and part of the reason why people are encouraged to see the data through these like skewed lenses is because the data is racialized in the first place. But then Wilfred was like, well, how else are you going to do it? I saw it. Right. He's like, but then how are we going to know if there's a discrepancy or something like that? And I'm like, listen, there are so many other ways to get the same information, or to get information that would actually be helpful, instead of keeping our heads in the clouds and keeping us in like this sort of matrix, semi-reality, because as you said, as soon as you start to go along the lines of white, Black, of color, Asian, etc., then you're going to interpret any and every discrepancy as proof positive of superiority or inferiority of any of those groups. And it's so nonsensical to me. I was talking recently with someone who pointed out, we talk a lot about the achievement gap, or what some people have called the opportunity gap. And people talk about the IQ gap. And the comparison is almost always between people who are racialized as white and those who are racialized as Black. But never mind the fact that people who are racialized as white perform woefully under par, first of all, like if we're being honest about the data, not even sufficiently, right? But then also in comparison to people who are racialized as Asian, and yet you never might be an overstatement. You almost never hear about the gap between so-called white people and so-called Asian people, or so-called Black people and so-called Asian people. And it's like,
they just call the Asian people white. They're white.
Right. And so to your point about giving people the argument, people frequently find a way to reframe it to support the white Black. Right. And I just, it's like so much is missed. So many opportunities are missed, and deeper understandings of ourselves and each other are just missed because we favor this nonsensical, way of seeing ourselves. I hope to help people out.
Coming up, my final segment with Sheena Mason, Assistant Professor of African American Literature at SUNY Oneonta, PhD in English literature from Howard University, and the founder of the theory of racelessness. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
The Charles Love Show continues on AM 560, The Answer. Here's Charles Love.
Welcome back. I've reached my final segment with Sheena Mason, Assistant Professor of African American Literature at SUNY Oneonta and the founder of the theory of racelessness. And in this segment, like I often in my interviews, I ask, what are the next steps? What can we do? How do we move in the right direction, if not solve this problem? And I understand some will not agree with her, but for those who do agree with her, I think that the hardest thing is trying to get in this current climate, people to understand they need to move away. Think about it. I'm saying move away from race and race crazy, saying it doesn't help to just put racism into, try to infuse it into everything. But here you're at the level of saying race doesn't exist. So the very thing you're arguing about doesn't work. So we can have different views on the theory, but I want to know how hard it is and what do you do when you're up against a society that is going in the other direction. All they want to talk about is race. Race is everything. So we talk about that and an interesting event she has coming up that people should go and hear them speak more about this theory.
Well, see, we got to talk about that. Unfortunately, the downsides of this, you and I have a great conversation. We can go on for hours, but this isn't a podcast where you can just do an hour and 45 minutes. You have a finite amount of time. So, but that is a great segue. So we have to talk about, so what is the next actions? I talk solutions here a lot. So what do we do? One, even if you're 100% right, you can't do this heavy lift on your own, right? So what do we do? How do we take steps and learn to whatever the first step is to stop racializing so we can understand the data, so we can learn what the truth is, so we can make a change? What do we do?
Well, fortunately, I'm not working alone. People can visit theoryofracelessness.org to get access to countless resources and other people who are working along the lines of deracialization. We have a conference coming up on September 24th in Lexington, Massachusetts. The we I'm speaking of is Dr. Carlos Hoyt and Greg Thomas, and we're calling it the Resolving the Racism Dilemma, and we spell racism with the word race in it. And we look forward to spending an entire day dedicated to helping people grapple with and identify ways that we can start to move forward together toward a raceless, that is limitless future. And the key is no longer making excuses or justifications for how we divide ourselves amongst ourselves and choosing a different path forward. And I'm opening the door to everyone to engage with any aspect of my work, because then you can take the toolkit and apply it in whatever industry, discipline, relationship you have. And my students will tell you be an infinitely better and smarter human being because of it.
So if I could take one takeaway or one thing that the average person can do to start moving in that direction, outside of going to your wonderful conference in Lexington, Massachusetts, what would you say they should do? Go
to theoryofracelessness.org.
That is a quick, simple thing. She is Dr. Sheena Mason, founder of the theory of racelessness and educator, mom of triplets. Wow, that's a heavy lift as well. And Sheena, it has been wonderful speaking with you. Learned a lot. Hopefully people enjoyed the conversation. They check out your podcast. They go to the website and go to Massachusetts to see you in person. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you, Charles.
I'd like to thank Sheena again for joining me. Check out her website, theoryofracelessness.org. You can find out more about it, support her, and find out where she's speaking. Check out Cut the Bull this week. Our guest is Pamela Denise Long, a former guest of the radio show, comes on to talk about her 3-point plan to unite America. She is definitely not pushing racelessness. And don't forget to pick up a copy of Race Crazy, another way to disseminate this important information. And as always, thank you for listening.